Welcome to today's program titled Work Culture Assessments, Assessing and Enhancing Your Work Culture Consistent with Business Goals and Legal Compliance Considerations. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials, along with the CLE attendance form, will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker for today's program, Anne-Marie Zalatel. Anne-Marie, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kate, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on your time zone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Kate said, I am Anne-Marie Zalatel, and I am an employment partner in Seyfarth Century City office, and I am joined here today by my Chicago-based employment partner, Tracy Billows. And Tracy and I are key members of Seyfarth's Workplace Counseling and Solutions Practice Group. And we spend our practice advising employers and providing really proactive, full service employment counseling and advice and strategies to help our clients really across a broad range of industries achieve their business objectives and at the same time effectively manage legal risk. And as part of our practice, one of the many things we do is partner with clients to help them assess their work culture and develop and implement strategies to really create and nurture the work culture that they seek to have in their businesses, consistent with both their objectives as well as the law. And in today's world of work, work culture is no longer a value add. It is a must-have. So with that, we will go ahead and jump right into today's presentation. Next slide, please. So here we've just included the topics we are going to cover in our hour today. And I will just start with the introduction. Next slide. Next slide. Great, thank you. So timing, in terms of an introduction, I want to talk about two things, really, timing and goals. Why should employers assess their work culture now? Well, as all of you, I'm sure know, we are in, if not the most transformative, certainly one of the most transformative periods in the world of work in history. We've had a confluence of events. We've had, COVID and the shift to remote work for many employers, as well as hybrid and distributed workforces. The pandemic also brought, as we've seen, employees shifting priorities. A number of employees, it's more important to them than ever before where they live, where they work, how long they work, and how they work. And that has triggered what has been referred to in the media as the great resignation. I don't think it's not always a resignation. I think, many folks who've left their positions do have to work, but they have decided that their employment is no longer a fit with their priorities, and so they've moved on to other employers. And as a result of that, and as a result of the economy, it's really a tight labor market. And we've talked to many of our clients who are competing to attract and retain top talent, as well as there have been a number of technological advancements in terms of how work is performed. A lot of a lot of tasks that were once performed by employees are not now automated. And finally, there are significant generational differences in terms of uh, millennials in particular, their priorities and what they seek, both in terms of their lives and work-life balance, as well as their employment. More than ever, culture is and sort of the employer's values and purpose are extremely important to them. In some cases, as important as compensation and other benefits. So for this reason, work culture, we see it as more important than ever in order for employers to attract, retain, and motivate top talent. And the great news here is that you don't have to passively sit back and hope that your employees create the culture that attracts others to join your company. You really can be strategic and proactive, and um, we can help you envision and create the work culture that attracts those most sought after applicants, and that you seek to attract, and also help retain your most valuable employees. Next slide, please. So in terms of goals, I'm often asked, well, what are we hoping to achieve if we assess our culture? And in terms of overall goals or broad goals, I've already talked about most of them already, but we have them here on this slide. It's really attracting, especially in this really tight labor market, the most highly sought after applicants. Let's face it, employers are all competing, for the same sought after applicants in their particular industry and with respect to certain positions, especially in technology and manufacturing. Also, retaining the most valuable employees. A work culture assessment can assist with that, because not only do we do you assess your culture, but as part of this assessment, you see where you are and you identify the gaps between where you are and where you want to be. And then we partner to help you identify, develop, and implement strategies to get you from where you are to where you want to be, consistent with your business objectives and the law. And so in that regard, we help you also lower turnover and, reduce and effectively manage legal risk, and just help you design and create the culture you seek to create that is consistent with your values and goals, as well as your legal obligations. Next slide. So here on this slide, we've included some more specific goals of an assessment. And the first is really to define your mission, vision, and values, because you want to define those in a way that is going to attract top talent, that will help sustain your culture, policies, and practices, because it's not just a matter of creating this culture. You are dependent upon your workforce to help nurture and sustain it. And so you want to attract employees and applicants who are a good fit for your mission, vision, and values. You also want to make sure that once you have those new hires, that they are well integrated into your workforce and culture, so that they feel invested and wedded to you. And this is particularly important now that so many employees are working either exclusively remotely or on a hybrid basis, meaning they're in the office a few days a week and working from home a few days a week. So integrating new employees is now not only more important than ever, it's also more challenging than ever. Um, a work culture assessment can help you with that piece as well. Um, and just ensuring that your current employees, those who have been with you, for the long haul, continue to feel valued and invested in their work and success at the company. Because if they do, then they're less likely to leave. Also, the assessment can help create a sense of belonging and connection. And this is, again, more important than ever with the remote and hybrid work environments. And also because what we are hearing from employees, in particular millennials, is that it's very important to them that they feel that sense of belonging and connection. Um, and at the same time, as I'm sure many of them also prefer to work remotely. So how to create sort of new strategies to help foster that sense of belonging and connection when you don't have necessarily all of your workforce, uh, you know, attending lunches or office meetings, things of that nature. Next slide, please. So turning to some additional goals, really the work culture assessment can help you ensure that employees and especially new hires are receiving the appropriate, training, supervision, mentoring, and despite the fact that your workforce is remote or distributed. I know a lot of our clients have, some employees are exclusively in the office, others are hybrid, others are exclusively remote and may not even be in the same city or, quite frankly, the same state as the rest of your workforce. So rethinking and reevaluating your strategies for training and supervision and mentorship, both the specific content as well as the means of delivery, are really important. Also, the assessment can help you develop and implement the policies and practices that are consistent with your culture that you want, and that goes to what I spoke of before, identifying kind of the gap between where you are and where you want to be, and strategically using policies and practices to bridge that gap. And speaking of gaps, we want to be sure to identify and remedy any legal compliance gaps and areas of significant legal exposure to help reduce that for you and more effectively manage that risk. And then proactively identify areas of what we often find is there are themes, right? There are common areas of employee concern and sources of either discontent or dissatisfaction. And the sooner you identify those and take steps to address them, the less likely it is that you will experience high turnover. Next slide. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Tracy to help us define what is a work culture assessment. Tracy?
Thank you so much, Anne Marie. I really appreciate it. Many of you have probably seen this term, work culture assessments, culture engagement, you name it. But what Anne Marie and I are really talking about today is when organizations want to sort of figure out the why, figure out the perceptions. And they want to do that by analyzing expectations, values, behaviors, policies, engagement, experiences of talent, all of those things ultimately for not only consistency with what the business wants to stand for and has in fact stated it stands for, but also for legal compliance considerations as well. You know, these cultural assessments are not a one size fits all. No two are the same for any organization that we work with. They really are meant to determine areas of opportunity for organizations to consider what are some short-term considerations and what are long-term development goals. And at the end of the day, you know, really each organization determines the purpose and scope of their cultural assessment based on what their current needs are, observations are, directives, you name it. Next slide. So to better understand cultural assessments and, you know, what they are and such, it's really good to talk about, you know, how are they performed, how are they used, all the key components. So next slide. One of the first things with a culture assessment is sort of understanding at the outset, right, what is going to be the project plan or scope and protocols? Is this going to be privileged? If it is, then it needs to be led by an attorney or a law firm or a group of attorneys, etc. Is there a reason why you want privilege? For example, is someone doing this cultural assessment because there have been recent complaints that have come up and they seem to be having those similar themes Anne-Marie talked about, right? And you want to get a better understanding of what may be happening. Additionally, a cultural assessment can look at a variety of different areas and data points and sources of information to best educate the organization about those perceptions, about why certain things may be happening or not happening for that matter. To Anne-Marie's point, it can include policy reviews that not only looks at, you know, is the policy effective in communicating what the expectations are to individuals? Is it clear? Is it consistent with our mission and values? And is it also legally compliant to the extent the policy is something that touches on such an area? Cultural assessments can include surveys. You've probably seen a variety of different survey tools that are out there. There are lots of third-party vendors that do these. Many of them partner with organizations, and we work with them with our law firm too. These surveys can be customized, as you know, to include any number of different topics, but ultimately it's another source of information. Focus groups. You know, cultural assessments often include focus groups, whether it's with samplings of employees across the country, sampling of employees in a particular job grade or at a particular location. Questions are developed consistent with the scope of the overall cultural assessment being done, and information is solicited in these focus groups. They're typically facilitated either by you know, someone from the outside, or they can be facilitated, of course, by internal teams. Anne-Marie and I frequently train teams on you know, how do you conduct these focus groups and collect this data and create this sort of spirit of sharing information and feeling comfortable doing so. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about data. Data. I often tease I went to law school so I didn't have to deal with math and numbers, but I can't escape the fact that there are key sources of information that can come from EEO-1 reports, retention reports, affirmative action reports, other inclusion and diversity data that may be tracked by your organization. All of those things can be incredibly helpful. Audits of your internal complaints and investigations. Anne-Marie and I have worked on different assessments where we really took a hard look at some of the internal complaints as well as the investigation results with them to understand why there was a perception as to how an organization was handling a certain type of complaint, right? Litigation is something else that can come up in a cultural assessment. Leadership interviews. You know, everyone does a tremendous amount of training for their organizations, ensuring their leaders are equipped with not only understanding legal compliance considerations, but best practices in leading, but also understanding from leaders, right? What are they seeing happening with their teams? What are they seeing from the perspective of the organization's culture? Other key stakeholder interviews, whether it's people who are heads of certain departments, certain functional areas, etc. Auditing many things that Anne-Marie already developed, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit further detail. Training programs, are they sufficient? Are they effective? Are they doing what we hope they accomplish? Performance management programs. What do our performance management program look like? What are the steps? Are we consistently following it? Are we not? How are the scores being assessed? Is there anything there that we need to look at? Our mentoring and coaching programs, are they being fully utilized? Could we somehow improve that to allow for better development of talent, retention of talent, succession planning? Our open door processes, having people come forward to communicate suggestions, concerns, areas of improvement. Hotline usage and metrics. I know many organizations that utilize outside anonymous vendors for their hotlines. And certainly that can be a source of data and information for organizations as they go through this process. Those vendors often can group and give statistics to organizations. They can look for themes, search for keywords, all of those things that can best inform an organization during a cultural assessment as to anything that might be a recurring theme or a concerning theme. And then there's a whole host of other areas that can come up. And this really can get customized to a particular organization's needs. As I said, for some individual organizations, they are very focused on one particular issue. Many of you have probably seen in the media, for example, there have been racial equity audits. That's an example of someone maybe looking to do a cultural assessment related to race and race in the workplace and how individuals of color feel that they are being treated in a workplace. So again, think broadly when you think cultural assessment, but also think narrowly in the context that you don't have to take everything on all at once. There are ways to define the project and the scope to best get to your most urgent needs and goals. Next slide, please. But there are legal considerations that we need to keep in mind related to these cultural assessments and things that are really important to ensure that organizations think about beforehand. Because sometimes what happens is people will call Anne-Marie and myself after they've already gone down this path. They're 2 to 3 months into it. And you can't really go back and sort of cloak things in privilege or provide that legal advice to stuff that's already been done. So what are some of those legal considerations to think about at the outset? Next slide, please. Well, for one, attorneys are able to identify some of the legal compliance gaps and areas of legal exposure, in addition to looking at many of these other areas that Anne-Marie already identified, such as why are we not recruiting a certain demographic to our organization? Why do we seem to be losing people in a particular geographic area? Why do we seem to be struggling with an increase in complaints, right? So not only do you want to get to the why, right, as I talked about before, but are there any legal compliance gaps that are also contributing to that why that need to be addressed? And if there are, what is the legal exposure and how can they be remedied? What are the strategies for addressing them? What are the strategies for fixing them? What can be done to ensure that those risks are minimized and compliance is maximized? And then, as I also mentioned, where attorneys are brought in at the outset of these cultural assessments, you're able to cloak much of the planning and decision-making in privilege to the extent that's something you need or want. And additionally, to the extent that you are going to be including compliance gaps and other legal things that could come up in a cultural assessment, have that cloaked in privilege as well. The issue sometimes with these cultural assessments is you also don't know what you're going to get. So for example, if employees are coming forward and raising complaints as part of this process of discrimination or harassment or retaliation, if people are saying there are perceptions that older workers are not valued, if people are saying there's a perception that individuals are not properly accommodated for their physical or mental disabilities, that is where partnering with counsel can be very, very critical to not only manage the cultural assessment, but the legal exposure risks that come along with those sorts of things. Now, that doesn't mean that every cultural assessment unearths those sort of issues, but because you don't know, that's why it becomes so critical to think through all the different components that could come up in the cultural assessment at the outset to ensure you're best prepared to address them if and when they do in fact arise. So with that, what we'd like to do is sort of give you some examples of how cultural assessments can be implicated in some of these areas. So I'm going to turn it back to Anne-Marie to start talking about a couple of those areas. Anne-Marie?
Thank you so much, Tracy. So next slide, please. So the first application is training and mentorship. So, as part of the assessment, we can evaluate, or you can evaluate, through those focus groups that Tracy mentioned, and other tools, how employees view the current training and mentorship opportunities that your organization offers, as well as any perceived gaps, and what could be real gaps. Identify those, and that way those can be remedied. Also, what's especially important now with remote and hybrid employees is to ensure that they receive the same training and mentorship opportunities as employees who are working for you, full-time from a company location. And this is particularly important because what studies have shown is that employees feel more connected. Remember, we talked about at the outset that feeling of connection and belonging in an organization. Training and mentorship are two of the tools used to cultivate that belonging. If remote and hybrid employees in particular feel that their employer is investing in their success and in terms of mentorship and helping them grow with the organization, if they feel that they have a future, they're more likely to feel connected and less likely to leave. Also, we can identify any biases or inconsistencies or real and perceived barriers to training and mentorship opportunities so that those can be addressed and removed. Also, seeking input from employees on additional types of training and mentorship that they would like to see the organization offer to them is something that that can be identified through an assessment. Next slide. So especially important with training and mentorship in today's world of work and remote and hybrid distributed workforces is evaluating the methods of the training delivery. Online programs versus in-person programs, and in-house training versus conferences. Now that I'm hesitant to say post-pandemic, but we're at least fortunately at a stage of the pandemic where there are more outside opportunities for training and conferences. And so looking at evaluating the methods of that delivery and considering whether any rebalancing between those methods is warranted, and whether any accommodations or adjustments are needed, especially given the makeup of your workforce, if it's remote, hybrid, or distributed. Also evaluating whether the existing opportunities that your organization offers, both in terms of training and mentorship, are consistent with the culture you want to enrich and encourage, and identifying any additional training or mentorship that could be offered to further enhance and foster that culture. And then once you have all that information and you've identified new programs and gaps to fill or rebalancing to accomplish, you can design and implement the new training and programs that you have decided to implement. Also, one thing that we found in these assessments is what's perceived can be very different from reality. And so sometimes it's not so much a matter of needing additional training or mentorship opportunities, but making sure that all of your employees, regardless of their work style, whether it's remote or hybrid or in person, and regardless of their location, that they're aware of the training and mentorship opportunities that the organization offers, and critically how they can take advantage of those opportunities, how they express their interests, how they enroll, etc. And finally, developing a strategy to increase mentorship opportunities for employees who work remotely. I think what our clients have found is that there's something with mentoring that, mentor relationships, have tended to often arise organically in the workplace, from just daily interactions, either in the kitchen or at an in-person meeting in the office. And so really thinking about and developing a strategy to foster those same connections for those who work remotely. Next slide. So the next application, and Tracy already spoke a little bit about this, but the measuring and assessing performance. It's critically important, both for legal reasons as well as for just culture reasons and employee retention reasons, that you measure and assess performance consistently across your workforce. And so, looking at the factors that are currently considered as part of that performance evaluation, and ensuring that those same factors are used across the board, and also determining if additional performance criteria, are needed or at least warranted in the new world of work, and determining the best way to define those criteria and to implement them. Also, identifying any real or perceived biases and inconsistencies or gaps in how performance is measured and assessed. Sometimes it's not a gap in how it's measured or assessed, or how it's supposed to be measured or assessed, but rather a gap in training managers and making sure managers are aware of the criteria and fully appreciate and understand the criteria that they are supposed to be using in evaluating employees' performance, and ensuring that they understand the importance of applying those criteria consistently to all employees they supervise. And then developing a strategy to address any improvements or enhancements that are needed in terms of your performance evaluation process. And it could be criteria, it could be the timing of the evaluation, it could be sort of the components of the performance assessment process, whether employees complete a self-evaluation. A lot of employees feel, clients have told us they receive reports from employees that they feel more invested and engaged if they are asked to assess their own performance, and as part of that process, identify their goals and objectives for the coming year. So that is another thing that you can look at as part of this assessment. And then also 360 reviews, whether you are going to assess the performance of those higher up in the organization. A lot of our clients have reported that that has been really instrumental to fostering that culture that they want to create, and that their employees really value. Sending the message that we also expect those who lead the organization, who are at the top of the organization, to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk, so to speak. Next slide, please. Also, in terms of the performance process, looking at feedback, and I talked a bit about this already, from the self-evaluation as well as the 360 reviews. And finally, looking at whether your current performance assessment process is really consistent with the culture that you seek to create and enrich, and also whether it effectively manages legal risk. And sometimes it's not just changes to your performance assessment process, but changes to how managers and supervisors are trained on how to use that process effectively and consistent with the way that the business expects and requires them to use it. And so with that, I am going to turn it back over to Tracy.
Thank you so much, Anne Marie. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about ensuring lines of open communication and how a work cultural assessment can help you with that. When we look for sort of these open lines of communication, one of the things that we consider is sort of what might be your current avenues of communication and what might be missing, or what are some possible gaps. If you had told me 20 years ago that Anne Marie could instant message me or Slack me in the middle of this presentation, I would have said, what is that? How is she going to communicate to me that way? If you had said to me that, people would use predominantly text messages for getting people's attention on key important issues, I would have been like, no, they're going to come walk to your office, or they're going to pick up the phone and call you. And so, look, I get that most of these forms of communication have been out there and being used in a variety of ways, but you do want to take a look at, how are they being used as well? For example, we have seen situations where people are posting their displeasure or their complaints in Slack, or in some other form of instant messaging. People on different calls may not realize that their messages are being captured as part of a webinar on Teams or WebEx or things of that sort. And additionally, you may not realize that there is some of these sources of information out there. And so really what this cultural assessment can do is help you get a handle on what does our talent view as our key, um, sort of modes of communication. How are they using them? Are we tuned into them? Are we paying attention to them the right way? Are we getting the most out of this? Also, in this new hybrid, remote, in office, you name it, environment, um, what are going to be the differences in communication style and approach? I often, going back to Anne Marie's mentoring example, but also in terms of keeping open lines of communication, there's some overlap. I often mentor some junior attorneys and such. And, my approach used to be we're all kind of adults. They'll find me, they'll get on my calendar, we'll get something, scheduled. And then I realized over the last few years, sometimes that meant I had to walk by the offices, and then maybe I just kind of, um, informally caught up with people, or that was the reminder to get something, scheduled. I don't have that option anymore. In many cases, if I walk down the hallway, I'm not necessarily going to find the person that I was hoping to casually run into. In that context, right, we want to be thinking about, so what do I need to do differently? And that's what a cultural assessment can help you identify, because, by asking some of these questions, by doing some of these analyses, by having these focus groups and surveys and other things, you can get a better sense from your teams. How do they want to communicate? What are the best ways to ensure that we're being intentional about our efforts to make sure that people know they can come to us, that they can ask questions, that they can get the guidance that they need, whatever it may be. And additionally, are the ways we are communicating, is that consistent with who we want to be as a culture? Are employees hearing information about key initiatives, key policies in the right way? Or are they hearing about it through the grapevine or through unofficial means that might suggest, for example, that, the organization is not effectively communicating with them or keeping them apprised of things that are important to them? Are things being communicated accurately? What do they always say, right? In the absence of information, right? All the speculation and, sort of conjecture sort of comes to the surface. Well, we don't want that. That's not only going to not be consistent with your goal of enriching your culture, but it also could potentially lead to legal risk, right? If people are saying, well, we don't think the organization is going to comply with this particular, directive or law, or we don't think the organization really values something because they didn't even tell us they were making this change, right? All of those things can come into play. And I know we got one question here that was asked about, with the workforce going through so many transitions, right? How do you best communicate formal policies, right? As you're going through these different phases, whether it's fully remote to hybrid and some fully remote to who's essential and needs to come into the office. These policies can be in a state of flux, let's be honest, because we are going through different phases and such. We strongly encourage organizations have the key sort of core formal policies always up to date with respect to, a variety of things, whether it's how people should be treating each other. But even those policies should be evaluated for how people are treating each other, whether it's in person, on Zoom, communicating over instant messaging, you name it. All of those things should now be covered. In terms of having formal written policies for every phase an organization may be in, probably not necessary, but certainly if you're going to be in a phase for a long period of time, or you think that this might be this sort of new semi-permanent phase, you're going to want to make sure people understand what that means. What is that phase? What are the rules of engagement? You want to be communicating the expectations. You want to ensure that people understand sort of what they're expected to do and how they need to operate. like I always like to say, you don't want your talent surprised. You don't want your talent surprised going, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to do that. Now I feel really bad, or I feel like I should have known this, or I should have done something differently, or whatever the case may be. So at the end of the day, it really becomes critical to ensure that you are looking at all of this holistically from an overall policy perspective, a process perspective, a policy perspective, and just general communications. Anne Marie and I have worked with a number of organizations in terms of them wanting to keep the lines of communication open during COVID, and where the organization stood, and whether the office was open or not open, or what the expectations were for people coming in. Sometimes, it was just, nicely prepared, very clear though, messaging that came out from leaders about what those expectations were. They weren't necessarily formal policies. We saw organizations where the CEO or president sent all sort of staff, if you will, communication messages, not necessarily about communicating these things, but letting the workforce and talent know that we're paying attention to what's happening in the world right now, and we're responding. We may not always have all the answers. We may not be able to say how long hybrid or remote or other things will exist, but sort of having those regular touch points and knowing that you're communicating, that you're there and looking at different things and encouraging people can come forward can go a long, long way. Next slide. So here's our next application, and I realize this is probably really small for some of you, so I'm going to go ahead and read it as well. What we thought, Anne Marie thought we would do, is talk you through a scenario for how cultural assessments could impact ensuring that an organization has, in effect, the right mechanisms for promptly and effectively responding to concerns from their talent. So here is the scenario we want to share with all of you. It is based off of a real life case, so that's why you see the outcome and takeaways. We changed the facts just a little bit, but it is based off of a real life case. A customer began frequently requesting online Zoom meetings with a female sales representative. The customer met with the employee about 2 times per week from September through December, and purportedly made sexually charged gestures to the employee, made remarks about her appearance, and sexually propositioned her. The employee told her supervisor about the conduct on a number of occasions, but did not make a formal written report, nor did the employee notify Human Resources until late in December. The employee did say, though, that she had also shared anonymous feedback as part of an employee survey about what she was experiencing. The employee is now alleging that her supervisor told her, just ignore the customer, let it go, turn off your camera. This kind of comes with the business of being a sales representative. The supervisor states, that should say representative, sorry, only told him that the customer was aggravating and never used the term harassment or provided details regarding the conduct. Once the employee notified Human Resources, they took immediate action and had the customer reassigned. After being terminated, so this female sales representative is terminated for an unrelated reason, the employee sued for sexual harassment, and the employer defended the claim, arguing, 1, that the conduct was not sufficiently severe or pervasive to constitute harassment, and 2, that the employee had failed to take advantage of its anti-harassment policy because she did not file a report with Human Resources or upper level management as was directed by the policy. So what do you think the outcome was here? Was the employer successful with these defenses? Feel free to type in the Q&A, yes or no. Let's see if we get some responses here. Was the employer successful in asserting these defenses here? What do we think? Oh, Anne Marie, I think we may have made this hypothetical too easy. I'm only getting no's here. Uh-oh. Maybe we need to make it trickier next time, Anne Marie.
Yeah.
Lots of great things. No, HR should have alerted HR as soon as possible. Part
Yeah.
of policy should include a manager's, responsibilities, et cetera, right?
We have a smart
Yes.
group
We
here
have
with
a
us
very
today.
smart group. No, they're not going to be successful. The supervisor, no.
Mm,
Right. Find the employee. The employer bears responsibility for initiating the investigation. That's exactly right.
yeah.
So, how would, from a takeaway perspective now, let's talk about how a cultural assessment may have helped in this situation. And look, by no means are Anne Marie and I suggesting that a cultural assessment is the end all be all and it's going to solve all your problems. If that were the case, we would be having a heck of a lot of fun with this program right now because we'd be able to say, here you go, all problems solved. But we want to be realistic. But it could have helped, right? It could have identified some things here. So first, right, let's assume as part of the cultural assessment, policies were being reviewed. Maybe the anti-harassment policy, hadn't been reviewed in a while from the perspective of a complaint procedure. Maybe the organization has gone through restructuring and, restructuring. And so now, the organization may not make sense to simply refer to upper management. People aren't going to know what that is, right? They're not going to necessarily know who's defined as that upper management. They're not going to know who are they calling with respect to that. And they may assume their own boss is upper management. So for all we know, this person may say to someone, well, I thought I was telling upper management. The person's above me, isn't that upper? And you may be laughing like, come on, Tracy, but this is the stuff we see in these cases that Anne Marie and I see,
Yeah.
right? These are the types of arguments that are made by individuals. And that's why taking a close look at that policy, making sure that it was super clear about what it was. I mean, and then some states, I don't mean to steal Anne Marie's thunder because she's the California expert, but luckily she and I have worked together long enough that by osmosis, she has educated me a little bit that I know, for example, in California, your policy has to tell managers and supervisors if you hear about something that is a violation of the anti-harassment policy, if you see something that's a violation, or if you hear about it, meaning someone comes and complains to you, here's the designated person that you need to report this to, right? So that's a legal compliance thing. Here in this case, this policy would not be, if this were in California, by the way, it was not. But if this case had been in California, that policy would have also been deemed legally non-compliant. So that's one area where a cultural assessment could have helped. Another area is, had you assessed the training? What Anne Marie was talking about earlier, right? Had you assessed your non-harassment training and looked at what was the content of the training? Do supervisors understand their responsibilities? Do employees know who to go to? That could have headed off some of this because that might have identified some gaps or some areas where the organization could have been more clear, could have done something about it. And
Also,
then additionally, the survey. So the survey. And we have a question here. Someone asked, is the survey considered notification? So you're going to get the legal answer that everyone hates getting from us. It depends, but it is possible. So that is one of the things about using a cultural survey or an engagement survey or an employee survey or whatever you're doing, or even these focus groups. Let's change the facts for a moment. Let's say your HR person is leading a focus group and the person in the focus group identifies this situation, right? Does that mean we are now on notice? Well, likely yes. The difference with an anonymous survey is if it truly is anonymous, right? And there's no way to assess, for example, what part of the company the person may be in, what role they may be in, etc. There may not be anything you can do. But here's why the it depends answer comes in with the anonymous survey. Oftentimes, and Anne Marie and I see this all the time when we partner with these organizations on the development of these surveys, individuals are asked to volunteer certain information. Maybe they volunteer their department, maybe they volunteer the state they're in, maybe they volunteer how long they've been with the company, maybe they volunteer who will be ultimately they like what sort of division they're a part of. If you get certain identifying information, then yes, you would have an obligation as an organization not to go talk to 500 people in that division or that department or that job grade, but HR would want to look to see, have there been any internal complaints from that area? Has there been any charges of discrimination filed from that area? Have we checked in with the leaders there to see how things are going and if anyone's brought anything to their attention, right? And all of this would come about from doing that follow-up on that employee survey. Have a couple other takeaways, but I do want to read the CLE code. We've got about 4 minutes left, and I don't want to miss doing that. And I guess the CLE code is SS, so Seyfarth Shaw, so that's SS 3625. So in terms of some other takeaways from here, that might come about that you might learn of also, through the cultural survey is also whether people feel your culture is in fact conducive to coming forward with these types of complaints, right? And if not, then you have some time to figure out why do people perceive that your culture is not conducive to having these types of complaints brought forward to the organization's attention. So for all of these reasons, right, a cultural assessment could help you identify some of these things before they percolate up in this way. And again, I'm not trying to suggest they would have stopped this particular situation from happening, but at the end, at the end of the day, simply telling this person, by the way, turn off your camera isn't going to be a solution here. Or even though that is our new reality, right? I could turn my camera off at any time if I feel Anne Marie is offending me. She doesn't, by the way. But if I did, I could turn my camera off at any time. But that's not really consistent with my firm's culture, right? My firm doesn't want me experiencing the behavior in the first place. So we need to get to that solution, not the solution of, well, just deal with it or things of that sort. And, excuse me, in this hybrid environment, think about, are your current mechanisms for people coming forward to raise concerns sufficient? And are you regularly reinforcing the ways people can raise concerns? People might have just simply looked at a posting on a bulletin board many, many years ago. Now maybe they'll go to your portal to find that. Or they may have just popped into somebody's office and said, hey, who do you think I should call about this, right? So you want to make sure that you're adequately communicating not only your commitment to follow these policies and ensure concerns are addressed, but also making sure that your employees understand not only that commitment, but all the ways they can do so. And simply having, one communication a year or one training a year is likely not going to be sufficient in our new world. So does it get included in a newsletter that goes out? Do you ask leaders to include it as part of their monthly or quarterly meetings? All of these things can be identified and discussed as part of that cultural assessment and give you the right avenues for moving forward and preventing some of these things from happening. I did get a question here that I wanted to respond to that says oftentimes, an organization, a large organization may take all of this on, but smaller or mid-sized organizations may not take on, such a broad project because they don't have the capability, whether it's they don't have the staff or they don't have the time or they don't have the budget, right? From my perspective with these cultural assessments, I take you back to what I said a little bit earlier. They don't have to be a one size fits all, and there never are. No two that we work on are the same. So even for smaller organizations, I encourage you to think about what are your top priorities going into the new environment that you're in, whether it's, partially remote, partially hybrid, whether it's partially on site, partially hybrid, whatever it may be. What are your key priorities? And where do you think you have some vulnerabilities? Do you have vulnerabilities in training? Do you have vulnerabilities in communications? Do you have vulnerabilities in loss of talent because they don't feel connected to you and your purpose anymore? Whatever it may be, focus on that area the first year. It's sort of like no different than prioritizing other business goals. You pick a single area. Trust me, while yes, a broad-based culture assessment can have positive impact, even a small cultural assessment has positive impact because it shows investment from the organization and its people, and it shows that the organization wants to strive to do the best that it possibly can. I apologize if there's any further questions. We are at time. I thank you again from Anne-Marie and myself for being here with us today. You've been a great group, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
This concludes today's